Hey guys, in this tutorial I'm going to show you how to make a stained glass sun catcher. So for this example, you're going to need your design and you'll need 2 copies of it. You'll need a board to do your soldering on. You'll need a soldering iron and solder. You'll need stained glass sheets, and you can use small pieces of stained glass as long as your shapes fit on those, that's fine. You're going to need safety glasses, rubber cement, liquid flux. You'll need the copper foil. We're going to use the 3/16 of an inch size. You're going to need a glass cutter, a pair of breakers, running pliers, a pair of scissors. You'll need needle nose pliers, round nose pliers, wire cutters, and a pair of tweezers. And then you're going to also need several eye pins and a variety of beads. So let's begin. So to begin your stained glass sun catcher, the first thing you're going to want to do is draw out your design. So what I've done here is, obviously you can see all of my shapes that I've already drawn out. I went back with a Sharpie just so that you could see it on camera so it shows up a little better. One of the things that I inform my students is that with the tools that we have in our classrooms, it's really difficult to make rounded shapes, so I always try to make sure that they limit those. What happens is when you're cutting the glass, you cannot cut with just a glass cutter by itself. You can't make a rounded curve in the glass. So for instance, with this circle here, they're going to have to go back and cut that glass almost like an octagon shape, and then go back with the glass grinder, which is another tool. It's an optional tool to use, and grind down those glass edges. The same with these, with the curves that cut into the rectangle, same thing. They're going to have to actually make that rectangle larger, kind of chip it away a little bit, and then go back and grind that down. So that's why we try to limit the amount of curved pieces. So from here, once I drew out my design, they would go back, number the pieces, which is what I've done. These little parts that are hanging down are just symbolizing the beads that will be on there, so we'll actually go back and solder on little jump rings, more or less, half of a ring, to attach those segments of chain and beads off of the glass, so it'll hang from there. So once I've made one drawing, I'm going to go back and make a second one. So you can, if you have access to a copy machine, that's ideal. If not, you can certainly trace it. So the reason you have 2 copies is because you're going to go back and cut one of them out. So when you cut out your pieces, you're going to want to have something to look back at. Otherwise, it's going to be really hard to know where those pieces need to be soldered together. Another thing that I suggest to them is that they color in their pieces to match the color of glass that they want. So I'm doing kind of these cool colors with the 2 peach, kind of orange peach circles for emphasis there. Another thing that I want my students to focus on is positive and negative space, and of course balance. The whole piece has to be balanced, but they're focusing on the positive space, which are the glass pieces themselves, and then the negative space, which is the space in between that's empty. So we like to have a good balance of that overall. So the next step I will show you, which is cutting out your pieces and putting them on the glass. So when I return, that's what we'll do. Next step, once you have drawn out your design, you've made your copy of it, gone back and colored in a copy if you want to do that, is you're going to cut out your pieces. And when you cut out the pieces, So if you choose to draw your design like I have with the showing where the chains of beads will be hanging down, you're actually just going to ignore those and cut out only the pieces themselves. It's really important that you cut, you know, as well as you can, stay straight on the lines, so that you don't mess up when it comes time to cut out your actual glass and make the piece too little or too big. So I've cut out the pieces, and the next step from there is to match them up to the correct color. So based on my color copy that I did here, you'll see this was the color that I intended for this particular piece here. So in our classroom we have whole sheets of glass, and then we have buckets full of the smaller fragments that are left over that we also use for our glass mosaic project as well. But the smaller the piece, the easier it is to cut. So that's why I try to encourage the kids to go for these smaller pieces and try to find them, because you are only making shortcuts versus the really long cuts. So it goes a little faster and it's easier. So this next step would be to lay out your glass on your pieces so that you're ready to go. So as you can see, as I've done here, and when you're ready to cut one, you're going to line it up. So I already have this straight edge ready to go, and I'm going to put the piece on here with rubber cement. And the reason we use rubber cement is that it dries and holds the piece in place, but it also peels right off really well. So if they mess up, or when the time comes and they're finished cutting all their pieces, they're going to have to remove the little sheet off of there anyway, their little template that we're using. So you don't want to use, you know, a permanent glue, like a super glue, because you don't want that piece staying on there forever. You want to be able to remove it. So the rubber cement is really great for that. So you glue it on there, let it sit for a minute so it can dry. And then from here, this is when you're going to cut your glass. So you can choose which side you want to do first. I always try to tell them to do the shorter cuts first. They have a cut here they're going to have to make and a cut here. So to shorten this cut a little bit, I would go ahead and have them do, make sure that stays, it's going to slip around until it dries. I'm going to have them do this cut first, and then they're going to go back and do this one. In the next step, when I show you how to cut the glass, I'm going to do it on a piece that doesn't have one of these, just so that here on camera you can see what I'm doing. Sometimes when I have this piece next to it, it's kind of hard to see what I'm actually cutting. So when I cut that glass, I'll do it without the little pieces on it. But when you are doing it, you need to make sure that you cut right along the edge here. The last thing I want to point out is so my intentions are to cut these 3 small shapes out of this one piece of glass. Do not go ahead and glue them on here at one time. You would glue one down, cut it out, glue the next one down, cut it out, and so on. Because what might happen is, for instance, if I put those pieces like that, if I cut this piece out, when I go to make this cut, it's going to cut right through that piece. So unless you lay these out perfectly, so for instance that would be okay, just glue them down one at a time. So glue it down, cut it out, glue down your next one, cut it out, and so on. So once you get all your pieces glued down that you're ready to cut at one time, then you can go back and cut them and then replace the rest of them and cut those out as well. So again, when I come back to the next step, I'm going to show you how to do the glass cutting. So my pieces are all cut out, and I've laid them back out on top of my original pattern so I can make sure that I put them in the right spot. When you look at them, you can see that you know, the rectangles are all cut out fairly straight, but obviously with the circles and some of the other pieces, the angles, they don't have perfect edges. So this is a case of where you can, at home if you're making this, if you have access to a glass grinder or glass sandpaper, you would want to use that to sand down or grind down the edges so that your pieces fit together better. It's not required, you don't have to do it, but it's certainly going to make you have a better overall outcome. The other thing is with these round pieces, when I cut them, I took my breakers and chipped away as much as I could to get it a little bit more round. That just saves time when I am using the glass grinder. So again, that's optional. I am going to show you now how to do that. So I'm going to move to my glass grinder station, and I'll show you how to do the glass grinding. When you're ready to begin using the glass grinder, the first thing you want to do is make sure that it has water in it. So I always make sure that the water goes over the sponge a little bit. The sponge with the water on it is what helps keep the grinder bit cool. So you want to pour water in here. Don't fill it up completely, but you'll be able to see it starting to come up. When you first turn it on, the bit, when it spins, is going to spray a little bit of water. That's just what's going to happen from pouring that over it. I'm going to make sure I use my safety glasses, so I'm going to put those on. And then I'm going to show you how to do your pieces. So I'm going to start with my first one here with the rounded part, and I'm going to peel off the number. I don't need that anymore. If you want to keep it on there to use as a guide, you certainly can. So for the sake of this, I'll show you how to do that. I'm going to turn it on. If you want to wear gloves, you can as well. And you're just going to go back and forth. And obviously your paper that's on there is going to get wet. And I'm pressing it into about the middle part. If you go above it, you're not going to hit the gritty diamond bit part. So you'll see what I've started to do there, how it's starting to smooth it out. And it's going to take a while to go back and do this. Let me just show you a little bit more here. And again, you can see how it's starting to smooth it out. So, let me turn this off. I'm going to finish doing these. I'm going to go through and grind them all, and then I'm going to show you the next step, which is wrapping your pieces with the copper foil. Now that I've finished grinding all of my pieces, you can see now how they fit together a lot better. They're closer, the edges, the circles are much more round, don't have those jagged edges. I am going to go back and finish cleaning off some of these. You can just use a wet paper towel or even some Windex to clean off that. That's just kind of residue from the grinder and the water. So what I'm going to do now, before I go back and finish cleaning them off, I'm going to go ahead and show you how to wrap one of these. So with a circle, when you get ready to wrap it, so you're going to wrap it with this copper foil, and it has a sticky backing to it, so you can see when you pull it away, you pull away the backing, and now the copper has a sticky back. When I wrap these, I want to start it, doesn't matter on the circles, you can start it wherever you want. If you're going to start it on one of the rectangles, squares, something with the sharper edges, 90-degree angles, whatever. I would suggest not starting it at the corner, but starting it in the middle of one of your edges. And the reason I say to do that is sometimes it pulls away a little easier if you wrap it on the corner, starting on the corner. So I'm going to position the foil so that it's centered directly over that edge of the glass. And as let me pull a little bit more away from here. As I wrap it, I'll pull the backing away from the foil. You want to make sure you get it centered really well. And I think the best way to do this once you get it started is to turn it over so that you can see that you have the same amount of foil sticking out from both sides. And then you can adjust it if you need to. I'm going to turn the corner here. I'm going to continue to pull the backing away. And I'm not pressing that down over the edges just yet until I get it wrapped all the way around. So now that I'm back to where I started, I'm going to overlap it just slightly over my starting point and trim it. And I'll press that down. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back. I'm going to press it down everywhere along the straight edges, or if you're doing the circle, you would do it all around the circle. And then when you come to the corners, what you're going to want to do is once you press the edges down all the way to those corners, then you can go back and press the corners down. You want to save the corners for the last part. You can get this copper foil in several different sizes. I like the size that I'm using here, the 3/16 of an inch, because when you go back and solder it, when your two pieces are together, especially with these small pieces, you're not covering up a lot of the glass. When you get the bigger foil, the wider foil, it covers up so much of the glass that when you get done soldering, you can barely see any of the color showing through. So that's why I like to use the little bit thinner kind. So you want to make sure that's pressed down really well. Go back over it several times. The last thing you want is for this to pull away from you when you're doing the soldering. So once that's pressed down, I'm going to put it back into its position here, and I'm going to move on to the next one. So I'm going to go through, I'm going to clean off the rest of these, wrap them all with the foil, and then I'm going to show you the next step, which is applying the flux and soldering. I finished up wrapping all my pieces in foil, and the next step was to go through and apply the flux on all of the areas where you see the foil. You'll end up doing this on the back side as well, but for now just do the front. So you just dip your brush in the flux, and it goes on clear, so you kind of just have to keep track of where you're brushing it on. And I've already done this, so I'm just going to show you kind of how you would do it. You go through, brush it on everywhere. That helps the solder adhere to the copper. So once you get that done, we'll set this to the side, and we're ready to begin soldering. So I have my soldering iron warm, and I have it in the little stand here. So, okay, now that I'm ready to do the soldering, I'm going to apply the solder at the joints, and then I'll go back and do kind of the straight lines. So for the sake of the tutorial, I'm going to show you how I would do just one part here. You're going to hold the spool of solder about half an inch to an inch above where you want it to fall, and then you'll touch the tip of the soldering iron to that solder, and it's just going to drop down there, and it's going to smoke a little bit and kind of sizzle. That's because it's hitting that flux that's on there, that liquid flux. So once I have those on there, and after I would go through and do all of the joints to hold everything in place, then I'm going to go back and melt it again, and just kind of drag that solder along the copper to smooth it out. And what's going to happen is anywhere that copper is, the solder will stick to it. If I were to accidentally drop a little bit on the glass, like, see if I can get some, that, once it cools back down, within just a matter of a couple minutes, hardens back up and cools down, I can just flick that right off of there. It's not going to stick to the glass. It wants to stick to the copper. So the other thing is you want to try to limit the amount of times that you go over the solder. The more you do it, the more it's going to appear kind of burnt or dingy. So try to only go over it, you know, as minimal amount of times as possible to keep it looking shiny and silver. So I'm going to go through, I'm going to solder all of the joints together and everywhere that these pieces connect. And then when I return, I'm going to show you how you'll do the edges, and then you'll flip it over and do the back side as well. So let me finish this up, and when I come back, that's what I'll show you how to do. I've soldered pretty much all of the joints and the edges where the pieces come together. There are a few that I left so I can show you how to do the edges of them. And the best way to do that, I think, is at the end, because what's going to happen is I'm going to flip it over and start soldering the back. And when I do that, then sometimes the solder drips through to the other side. So I would do the back side, come back, do the edges, and then touch up any areas on the front that might need touching up. Like I see some spots here and here that are a little bit thick, so I'll go back and smooth those out at the end. So what I've done is I've already turned it over, and I applied the flux everywhere. Again, it's really important that you apply that where the solder is not going to stick. So I've already done that off camera, and I went through and started to solder the back areas. And it's up to you at this point if you want to do everything that you see, or if you just want to do the areas where they join. If you want to leave these spots like this empty, you can. If you know that you're going to hang this somewhere that no one's going to see the back side, you can certainly save the solder and not do that. So basically here, again, you would just go through, apply the solder wherever you need it to go, and then smooth it out. And once you get all of it done on the back, then you're ready for the sides. So in order to do the sides, I think the easiest thing to do is to turn it on its side like this to whatever edge you are ready to do. So let me find one here, and you want to position it so that it's pretty stable. So I'm going to go in and do a couple of these edges here, and the best way to do that, I think, is to get a little bit of the solder on the tip of your soldering iron and just run it back and forth over those edges. And usually a little bit goes a long way on the edges. So I just did 3 of those edges, actually all 4 of those, with that little bit of solder that I picked up there. So the edges are actually pretty simple. The biggest thing is you want to make sure that it's smooth and that you don't get big clumps in the corner. And if so, you just want to re-melt that solder and smooth it back out so that it's nice and even. Okay, so at this point, I'm going to go through, I'm going to finish soldering the front, the back, the sides, get all that finished up. And then I'm going to show you how you're going to solder on either pieces of solder, if you want to use that, or if you want to use jump rings, make your own jump rings, whatever, some kind of hooks onto here to be able to attach your chain and to be able to attach your strands, your segments of beads that are going to hang in these little areas here. So once I finish doing all the soldering, I'll show you how to do that. So the next step, I turned the piece over, soldered everything on the back. I also went back through and added some additional copper foil in the areas where I knew that I was going to attach the eye pins so that my beads could hang from those. So you'll see the ones that I've already attached on, and then you'll see this exposed foil here. So what that does is that gives me more of an edge to solder those eye pins onto versus just, you know, a little bit of an edge here or here, which is just not enough for that to grip onto. So I'm going to go back and add the solder onto this here, and that foil is going to want to slip around on you until you get it soldered to that side edge that I've already done here. So let me get that kind of in place here. And I'll show you how to attach the eye pins. And this is the back of my piece, so like I mentioned before, it doesn't really matter what it looks like. If you're planning on actually hanging this in a window where you would see both sides, it's going to take a lot of work to get both sides really smooth and neat looking. It can be done, but it is definitely challenging with this method of doing stained glass. If you did the lead came, that's quite a bit easier. Okay, so let me get that excess off there. All right, so the way I'm going to do these, I'm going to hold the eye pin, which I've already cut, with my tweezers. And because I already have solder here, there's enough in place. And I'm going to melt the existing solder that's below it. And because it's thick, sometimes it takes it a second to get going. Try this side here. You have to give it a second. There we go. So you melt that into place, and you have to hold it for just a second while it dries and hardens back up, just like that. I'm going to put my next one on. So again, I'm going to melt the solder, put my piece into place, melt it, and now those pieces are both on there. I've also went ahead and soldered on two pieces where my chain will hang to be able to attach my chain onto there. So what I'm going to do now is when I return, I'm going to show you how to make the segments of beads that will hang from these. I'm going to go ahead and make all of them but one and attach them on, and then I'll show you how to make that last one. Okay, so before I show you how to attach these, I want to show you how to make one of your segments that will hang from the hooks that you soldered into place. So to do that, you would take a head pin, which has the flat bottom, and slide on the beads in whatever order you want. And when you do this, you're going to make a certain amount of segments based on the length you want it to be. So if I wanted, for instance here, I just have one segment. Here I have three connected together to make that particular strand longer. So if you're going to just do one, you would just use the head pin, snip off the extra, and make your loop and connect it. For these that have two or three, you need to use a head pin on the bottom, but then you need to switch to using the eye pins that have the little loop on them, because that's what you will connect to that top loop. So for instance, if I wanted to make this into a segment that has, or a strand that has more than one segment, I'm going to put on my beads. I'm going to cut it once I have enough. I'm going to use my round nose pliers and twist it to make that loop like this. And if I want to add an additional segment, I'm going to, like I said, switch to the one with the loop on it. That way I can connect that to this one. So again, I would put on whatever beads I want to use. And once I get those in place, I would again snip off if there's any extra. This particular one I don't have any extra. Make my loop, and then I'm going to connect those two together. So I would just open up one of the loops and connect them together, and that would give me my segment. So once you have that done, so I did all of mine, made them all. I've already connected all of these, so I'm going to show you how to connect this last one here. So you're going to open up your link, put it into place here,